Isaiah Zay Coleman sat near the window, in the small classroom of the Crescent Community Center in New Orleans, his fingers tapping rhythmically on an old leather-bound notebook. At 72, it wasn't nervousness, just an old habit he'd never shaken, despite his wife, Esther, reminding him multiple times. Amid the room's constant buzz, that tapping kept him focused, as if pulling him back to himself, in a place he didn't much care for. He'd once sat in a classroom like this, years ago, a skinny kid with quick hands, and a mind always brimming with music. The teacher back then had barely noticed him, until the day she decided to make him the class laughingstock. A public takedown, she thought. But as soon as he started playing, each note rang out like a slap to her arrogance, and in that moment when the class froze, her face stiffened, stunned, flustered, and unable to hide the truth. She'd misjudged him, completely. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest video. The classroom at the Crescent Community Center was cramped but lively, filled with the cheerful chatter of older learners before the session began. Pale light from the window spilled onto Zay's wrinkled face, illuminating brown eyes now dimmed by time. The notebook in front of him was covered in scribbles, not lesson notes, but musical notations he drew from an old habit of his piano-playing days. He liked to get things done quickly, wrap up early, like back when he performed in jazz bars, where every piece had to be perfect before the crowd left. But now he just sat there, amid the bustle, trying not to draw attention. At the front of the room, Evelyn Eve Carver stood tall, hands clutching a stack of notes, her eyes scanning the learners with cool confidence. Eve, around 55, had neatly tied blonde hair and a voice sharp as a blade. She called herself a classical music expert, with nearly 20 years of teaching under her belt, and this class was her way of cementing her reputation in New Orleans. The learners whispered that she was strict but fair, at least with those she liked. Zay had never been one of them. He'd sensed it from the start, though she never said it outright. She didn't yell, didn't insult him directly, but she rarely called on him when he raised his hand. If he answered correctly, she'd nod and move on in a flash. If he got something wrong, rare as it was, she'd linger, as if savoring his mistake. Zay noticed, and so did a few others in the class. Zay didn't want to be there at all. If it weren't for Clara, his granddaughter, he'd be at home in his little wooden house near the French Quarter, listening to jazz on the radio, and fixing bikes for the neighborhood kids. But Clara had begged, "You need to get out, Grandpa Zay. This class will be fun." He'd agreed reluctantly, bringing his notebook like a shield, though he had nothing left to prove to anyone. Music had once been everything to him. Nights playing piano in New Orleans bars, applause ringing out, dim lights glowing, but that was the past. Now he was just a quiet old man, living with memories, and a dusty piano in his living room. Next to him, Leon Brooks, a 33-year-old with a mischievous grin, whispered as Eve flipped through her notes. "Yo, she barely even looks at you," Leon said, his voice low but clear, eyes flicking toward Eve. Zay paused his tapping for a second, glanced at Leon, then shrugged. "Guess so," he replied shortly, voice even, resuming his tapping on the notebook. But Leon wasn't done. One afternoon earlier, as they waited for class to start, Leon had whispered to him, "You got like teacher invisibility or something." Zay just shrugged again, his lips twitching into a tired half-smile. "Guess so," he said once more, not bothering to explain. He didn't mind. He was used to being overlooked, from his youth, when white promoters refused him big stages, when audiences walked out mid-set just because he wasn't who they wanted to see. The classroom still buzzed with pre-lesson chatter, but Zay kept his eyes on his notebook, tapping steadily, trying to ignore Eve's gaze. She stood at the front, flipping through her notes, at a deliberate pace, preparing to start the session. He listened, waiting for the familiar pattern to repeat. She'd call on someone else, skip him like always. He didn't expect more. He just wanted to sit quietly, keep his promise to Clara, and go home. But today, something felt off. As she scanned the room, her eyes occasionally lingered on him, Not the usual fleeting glance, but a longer look, as if she were waiting for something. Zay felt it, though he wasn't sure what it was. Eve had been teaching music for nearly 20 years, a career she often mentioned with quiet pride. She wore a light gray high-neck sweater, and thin-framed glasses perched on her nose, crafting an image of stern sophistication. The learners in the class, older folks seeking joy in music, often said she was fair, but Zay knew that wasn't entirely true. With him, she wasn't fair, nor was she blatantly unfair. She didn't yell, didn't insult him outright, but her indifference had its own edge. When he raised his hand, she rarely looked his way. When he answered a simple question about jazz rhythm, something he knew better than anyone in the room, she'd just and move on quick as a flash. But if he slipped up, rare as it was, she'd pause longer, her lips pursed as if enjoying the moment. Zay noticed, and he wasn't the only one. Next to him, Leon Brooks, the 33-year-old with a mischievous grin, leaned over to whisper, as Eve turned to write on the board. "Yo, she barely even looks at you," Leon said, his voice low but clear, eyes flicking toward Eve with amusement. Zay paused his tapping for a second, glanced at Leon, then shrugged. "Guess so," he replied shortly, resuming his tapping on the notebook. Leon chuckled softly, shaking his head, but didn't press further. One afternoon earlier, as they waited for class to start, Leon had once told him, "You got like teacher invisibility or something." Zay just shrugged again, replying, "Guess so," not bothering to elaborate. He didn't need to explain. He was used to this treatment from his younger days, when white promoters looked past him like he wasn't there, when audiences left, because he wasn't who they wanted to hear. But today, Eve's indifference didn't feel quite so simple. She stood at the front, flipping through her notes, starting the lesson, a discussion on music history, from classical symphonies to jazz origins. Zay took notes, listened, waiting for the usual pattern. She'd call on someone else, skip him like always. He didn't mind, he was used to being overlooked, and at this age, he had nothing left to prove. But then, the unexpected happened. "Zay," Eve called, her voice sharp as a cut, ringing out in the quiet room. Heads turned. Zay blinked, his fingers stopping mid-tap. She'd never called on him, ever. He sat up straighter, eyes darting to the board for a clue. The topic was jazz origins in New Orleans, something he knew like the back of his hand. "Jazz started with black communities here," he said slowly, voice low but steady. "They played to get through hard times, to tell their stories." A textbook perfect answer. Eve pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing behind thin-framed glasses. She said, her tone not quite praise. "Not bad, not bad." A few learners exchanged glances. Leon, next to him, shot Zay a look like, "What's going on?" Zay shrugged inwardly, not responding. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he felt a slight shift. Eve wasn't completely ignoring him anymore. The lesson went on, Eve's voice droning steadily, talking about the first jazz artists, the clubs in the French Quarter, where Zay had played as a young man. He listened, took notes, but his mind wasn't as calm as before. Her eyes flicked to him more often, not the quick glances of before, but longer, sharper, like she was sizing him up. Zay felt the difference, though he didn't know where it was headed. He kept his eyes on his notebook, listening to her lecture on jazz history. Eve stood at the front, hands clutching her notes, her voice ringing with cool confidence. As she spoke of New Orleans' first jazz artists, she talked about the clubs on Basin Street, the songs born from pain and hope, things Zay had lived, had played with his own hands. He took notes, not because he needed to learn, but to keep his hands busy, to avoid her gaze. But then, it happened again. "Zay," Eve said, her voice sharp as a cut, slicing through his thoughts. Heads turned once more. Zay blinked, his fingers halting mid-tap. He sat up straighter, eyes scanning the board. The topic was jazz origins. Again, something he knew like the back of his hand. "Jazz started with black communities here," he said slowly, voice low but steady. "They played to get through hard times, to tell their stories." A textbook perfect answer. Eve pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing behind thin-framed glasses. She said, her tone not quite praise. Not bad, not bad. A few learners exchanged glances. Leon Brooks, next to him, shot Zay a look like. Again, Zay shrugged inwardly, not responding. He wasn't sure what game she was playing, but he felt a shift. Eve wasn't just indifferent now, she was watching him, like a cat eyeing a mouse before pouncing. The lesson continued, but Eve's attention on Zay didn't fade. She glanced at him more often, her eyes carrying a cold curiosity, like she was waiting for something from him. Zay kept tapping, trying not to notice, but he couldn't deny today was different. He was used to being overlooked, but the way Eve watched him now wasn't indifference. It was expectation, an intent he couldn't yet figure out. Then, just before the bell signaled the end, she made her move. Zay, Eve said, her voice cutting through as people started packing up. Stay behind a minute. A few heads turned, but no one spoke. Zay slowly folded his notebook, tucked it into his old canvas bag, and walked to Eve's desk. She stood there, hands clasped, her eyes sweeping over him with a subtle smugness. I heard you talking the other day, she began, her voice even but weighted. Zay frowned, unsure what she meant. About what? He asked, voice low but wary. You said your grandfather was a musician, Eve continued, her lips curving slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Zay nodded slowly. Yeah, he played piano, jazz. He didn't elaborate, not wanting to open up to her, but Eve tilted her head, her hands tapping lightly on the desk, like she was savoring the moment. Interesting, she said, her tone carrying a hint of mockery. Zay didn't miss. She leaned back in her chair, looking down at him. You must have picked up a few things from him, right? Zay didn't answer right away. He sensed something off in her tone, but he couldn't pin down her angle. Some, he said finally, voice, even. Eve's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good, she said, then paused, as if weighing her next move. The bell rang. Learners shuffled out, but she held him there with her gaze. Tomorrow, she said, her voice suddenly sharp. Show us what you've got. Zay turned to face her. What do you mean? He asked, though he was starting to understand. Eve tilted her head, pointing to the dusty piano in the corner. That piano, she said, her voice light but loaded. You'll play something for the class. Zay looked at her, then at the piano. Yellowed keys, peeling paint, a ghost from his past. A few lingering learners by the door paused, eyes darting between them. What? He asked, voice low but firm. Eve tilted her head, as if his question amused her. Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you've got some talent in you. Zay caught her tone. Not curiosity, not encouragement, but a trap. He stayed silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. All right, he said, voice calm but firm. Eve smiled, but her eyes were ice cold. Zay turned, walked out, hand gripping his bag strap. He felt her stare on his back, but he didn't look back. Her words echoed in his mind. Not an invitation, but a trap set in place. He stepped onto the narrow street, near the French Quarter, the red sunset glowing through the old oaks. But he didn't notice. His head spun with their exchange, with Eve's cold stare, and her mocking smile devoid of warmth. He knew what she wanted. She wanted him to fail, to humiliate him in front of the class, to prove he was nothing but old stories about his grandfather. Zay reached his small wooden house as night fell, the familiar damp smell of New Orleans seeping through the open window. He dropped his bag on the floor, sank into his old armchair, and stared at the dusty piano in the corner. Yellowed keys, peeling paint. It was just like the one in the classroom, a ghost from a past he'd tried to bury. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, their conversation replaying like a broken record. This wasn't a request, it was a challenge, and he knew her intent. She expected him to falter, to play poorly, to reinforce the image she had of him. A black old man not worth a damn. But Eve didn't know the whole story. Zay's grandfather, the one he'd mentioned, wasn't just a musician. He was a street jazz artist, playing piano in New Orleans' roughest bars, with a talent even bigots had to respect. Zay had learned from him, played alongside him on humid summer nights, dreamed of big stages, but that dream had shattered, contracts denied, audiences walking out, and Esther's death, the one who always believed in him, had made him give it all up. Now Eve wanted to dig up that past, not to honor it, but to mock it. Zay clenched his fists, anger mixing with fear. He didn't want to touch those keys again, but he didn't want her to win either. The next morning, Zay entered the classroom with a heavy feeling, each step carrying a memory he didn't want to face. Word of Eve's challenge had spread fast. As he sat by the window, fingers tapping his notebook again, whispers swirled around him. Leon Brooks, with his mischievous grin, leaned over from the next seat. "You playing piano today, huh?" he asked, his tone teasing, eyes gleaming like he was waiting for a show. Zay didn't reply, eyes fixed on his notebook, tapping steadily. He didn't want to give Leon more to laugh about. Dorothy Miles, the silver-haired lady up front, turned to look at him with curiosity. "I didn't know you were a piano guy," she said, her voice soft but genuine. Zay shrugged, lips twitching slightly. "There's a lot folks don't know," he replied briefly, voice low but not cold. Dorothy nodded, satisfied, and turned away. But Leon wouldn't let up. "You really gonna play?" he asked again, louder, drawing a few heads his way. Zay glanced at him, pausing his tapping for a second. "Guess so," he said, then returned to his notebook, like the question wasn't worth more. Eve walked in, setting her notes on the desk with subtle smugness. She barely glanced at the learners settling in, but her eyes flicked to Zay, lingering a moment, as if checking he'd shown up. She didn't mention the piano, not right away, starting the lesson as usual, her voice steady, talking about music history, from classical symphonies to jazz. Zay listened, but his mind wasn't there. It drifted to the moment he'd face that piano, those yellowed keys he hadn't touched in decades. He knew Eve was waiting, not to hear him play, but to see him fail. The first half of the lesson dragged on, like an endless song. Zay barely heard a thing, his ears buzzed, his mind racing ahead to when she'd call him. He stared out the window, morning light filtering through the old oaks. He wasn't sure he could still play. His hands shook more now, and memories of old tunes had faded. He recalled her tone, how she'd said, "I'm sure you've got some talent in you," like it was a joke. He clenched his fists under the desk, anger overtaking fear. As the lesson neared its end, Zay knew the moment was coming. He didn't need to see Eve to feel her gaze, a cold draft sweeping through. He took a deep breath, fingers stilling, telling himself he wouldn't back down. Whatever happened, he'd step up to that piano, not for Eve but for himself. Eve set her notes down, glancing at the wall clock with subtle smugness. "We've got a little time left," she said, her voice light but loaded. She turned, her gaze landing on Zay, lips pursed into a faint curve. "Zay," she called, sharp as a blade, "let's see what you can do." The room's mood shifted instantly. The chatter stopped, chairs creaked as people turned to look. A few stifled giggles broke out, quickly hushed, but loud enough for Zay to catch. He didn't move right away. He felt every eye on him, his heart beating not fast, but strong, steady, like an old drumbeat he'd once played. Leon Brooks, beside him, whispered with a sly grin, "Good luck, old man." Dorothy Miles, the silver-haired lady up front, turned with a mix of curiosity and doubt. Zay took a deep breath, stood, his notebook slipping lightly onto the desk. More soft laughter came from the corner. Someone muttered something he couldn't make out, but he didn't need to. He knew that tone, had heard it as a young man, when audiences mocked before he'd even played a note. He walked to the piano, each step dragging up old memories, dingy bars, scornful stares, and the rare applause he'd earned. The piano stood quietly in the corner, its keys yellowed by time, some chipped at the edges. Zay stood before it, running a hand lightly over the keys, feeling dust cling to his fingertips. It was out of tune, not much, but enough for him to notice. He took a deep breath, sat on the hard wooden bench, and rested his hands on the keys. He heard another stifled laugh behind him, low, clear, like a needle to his pride. But this wasn't just about proving Eve wrong. This was about proving them all wrong, and he'd do it in a way they'd never forget. The classroom had never been so still. Eve stood by her desk, arms crossed, her eyes behind thin-framed glasses, glinting with smugness, like she was waiting for a clumsy farce. Learners leaned forward, some expecting disaster, others just curious. Zay set his fingers on the keys, a familiar feeling rushing back, though this piano wasn't the warm, loved one his grandfather had at home. He closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and let the silence settle. Then he played. The first notes came soft and steady, a slow blues melody, the kind his grandfather played on humid New Orleans afternoons. His left hand held the rhythm, solid as a heartbeat, while his right traced the tune, gentle but sure. The room shifted, whispers died. Those who'd giggled sat still, eyes wide. Eve crossed her arms tighter, her brow furrowing slightly. She'd expected hesitation, a shaky start, but instead she heard something she hadn't anticipated, a fluid, alive piece, like a story told note by note. Zay didn't pause to see their reactions. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He played for himself, for his grandfather, for Esther, who'd listened to him through long nights. He sank into the music, each note a memory reborn. His fingers glided, precise yet full of feeling, like a conversation with the piano. Then he took a risk. He shifted to a trickier tune, a jazz piece his grandfather had taught him, his left hand roaring with deep bass, his right sketching complex runs across the keys. He'd struggled with it for months as a young man, but now it flowed naturally, like time hadn't stolen a thing. The longer he played, the heavier the room grew with silence, not apathy, but awe. The music filled every corner, pulling them in like notes once pulled crowds in old bars. Leon sat up straight, eyes wide, his teasing grin gone. Dorothy leaned forward, hands gripping her chair, as if recalling something long past. A few learners swapped looks, faces mixing shock and admiration. Zay pushed harder, letting the final melody erupt, chords echoing off the walls, a fast run shaking the air with power no one saw coming. Then he stopped. The last note rang out, hanging in the air for a second before fading. Zay lifted his hands from the keys, set them on his lap, and breathed deep. No one moved, no one spoke. Then a clap came from the back, small but clear. Another followed, then another. In seconds, the room erupted with applause. Leon let out a low whistle. "Man," he said, shaking his head. Dorothy clapped harder, eyes shining. "I didn't think you had that in you," she said, voice trembling with surprise. But Eve didn't clap. She stood by her desk, arms still crossed, lips pressed tighter than ever. Zay didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He knew she'd wanted him to fail, had waited for him to stumble, but he'd done more than that. He hadn't just played. He'd changed something in this room. The applause kept going, learners glancing at each other, like they'd seen something they weren't meant to, something they'd never forget. Zay sat still, breathing steady, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the energy that had poured out of him. Leon Brooks, the 33-year-old next to Zay, let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man," he said, his voice cutting through the applause, "I didn't know you could do that." Dorothy Miles, the silver-haired lady up front, clapped harder, her eyes gleaming like she'd rediscovered an old memory. "Wonderful," she said, voice shaky with emotion. "I haven't heard playing like that in ages." Other learners looked at each other, faces blending shock and admiration, as if they'd just seen something beyond what they'd expected. The applause swelled, filling the room, sweeping away every space doubt had once held. Finally, as the clapping began to fade, Eve spoke. "Well," she said, her voice short and sharp, "that was unexpected." Learners turned to her, some still whispering excitedly, but the room's energy had shifted. It wasn't just a regular class anymore. She tilted her head, fixing Zay with a knife-sharp stare. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" she asked, her tone carrying something she couldn't hide, not admiration, but irritation mixed with curiosity. Zay looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time, unflinching. "From my grandfather," he said, voice low and steady. Something flickered across Eve's face, a quick frown, a spark gone before anyone could catch it. She straightened, her hands tapping lightly on the desk, the only sound in the now silent room. "I see," she said, then paused, like she was brushing off whatever thought had crossed her mind. She turned to the class, her voice regaining its usual control. "All right, let's get back to the lesson." But no one moved right away. Leon still stared at Zay, eyebrows raised like he couldn't believe his eyes. Dorothy sat upright, hands still clutching her chair, as if the moment had been cut off too soon. Another learner, Anna Perry, whispered to her neighbor, "I didn't think he could play like that." But Leon spoke up first. "Hold up," he said, voice rising, eyes shifting from Eve to Zay. "That's it. He just played like he waved a hand vaguely, like something on the radio, and you're just going back to the lesson." A few heads nodded in agreement. Eve's lips tightened, her gaze snapping to Leon like an arrow. "What did you say?" she asked, voice icy. Leon shrugged, leaning back in his chair, but he didn't back down. "I mean, you made a big deal about him playing. Now he kills it, and you just say back to the lesson. That's weird." Murmurs of agreement rippled from a few others. Eve gripped the edge of her desk, but she didn't reply right away. Zay took a deep breath, feeling the room grow heavier than ever. He looked straight at Eve, his voice ringing out, calm but cutting. "You didn't think I could play, did you?" The question hung in the air, like an unresolved note. A few whispers stirred around the room. Eve raised an eyebrow, her eyes locking onto his, cold and probing. He didn't let her off. "That's why you called me up here," he went on, voice still even. "You thought I'd mess up." The whispers grew louder. Eve exhaled slowly, her fingers curling slightly on the desk's edge. "I was just giving you a chance to show your talent to the class," she said, her tone stiff but unconvincing. Zay shook his head slightly, not breaking eye contact. "No, you weren't," he said, voice steady, unwavering. "You thought I'd mess up. That's why you asked me to play." The whispers were clearer now, a few people exchanging questioning looks. Eve's mouth tightened, her jaw trembling faintly. "That's enough, Zay," she said, her voice rising, like she wanted to end it. But he wasn't done. He glanced around the room, at Leon, Dorothy, the ones who'd doubted him, who'd snickered when she'd called his name. "You didn't call Leon," he said, nodding toward him, "or Dorothy, or anyone else. But you called me. Why?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Eve's eyes darkened, her posture stiffening, but she didn't answer. "Sit down," she said finally, voice cold as stone. But for the first time since stepping into this class, Zay didn't obey right away. He looked around the room once more, at the faces that had once dismissed him, that had chuckled when she'd singled him out, now watching him differently. Then he stood slowly, the silence in the room heavier than ever, charged like static. Zay sat down, his fingers no longer tapping on the old leather-bound notebook. He breathed evenly, his gaze drifting to the window, where the old oak swayed in the breeze. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, he didn't need to. What he'd just done, not just playing piano, but facing Eve head-on, spoke for him. Whispers started up around the room, no longer teasing or doubtful like before. Leon Brooks leaned over, eyebrows raised. "What'd you just do in there?" he whispered, voice mixing surprise and awe. "You just flipped this whole class upside down." Zay shrugged, lips twitching slightly. "Guess so," he replied shortly. But inside, a gentle feeling spread, not victory, but release. Eve tried to regain order. "All right," she said, voice higher than usual. "Let's continue the lesson." She opened her notes, eyes glued to the page, like she could erase what had happened. But the class didn't snap back to its old rhythm right away. Dorothy Miles still watched Zay, her eyes bright, like she'd rediscovered an old memory. Anna Perry, usually quiet, whispered to her neighbor, "I didn't think he could do that." Leon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes shifting from Eve to Zay, like he was sizing something up. "Weird," he muttered, loud enough for a few to hear. "She made a big deal about him playing. Now she's acting like it's nothing." Eve heard, but didn't respond. Her hands gripped her notes tighter. Her eyes swept the room, but avoided Zay. Her authority, once sharp as a knife, now felt fragile, like cracked glass. She pressed on with the lesson, her voice droning about jazz history, but the learners weren't as focused as before. They glanced at each other, whispered, their eyes often landing on Zay, not with doubt, but with newfound respect. Zay felt it, though he didn't show it. He sat still, hands on his notebook, listening but not writing. He didn't need to take notes anymore. Today, he'd written his own story. When the bell rang to end the session, chairs creaked as learners packed up, their chatter livelier than usual. Zay slung his canvas bag over his shoulder, ready to leave, but Dorothy called out to him. "Zay," she said, voice earnest, "I heard you play at a little bar on Basin Street, back in the 70s. I didn't recognize you till today." Zay paused, looked at her, then nodded slightly. "Is that so?" he said, voice low but not cold. Dorothy smiled. "You played great, don't stop, okay?" Leon, passing by, clapped his shoulder. "Sorry for messing with you earlier," he said, his grin now free of mischief. "You're the real deal." Zay nodded, saying nothing more, and headed into the hallway. But just before he left the room, Eve's voice cut through. "Zay," she called, sharp but lacking her usual confidence. He turned, seeing her by the desk, still clutching her notes. She looked like she wanted to say something big, something real, but then her eyes hardened. "I hope you understand this is still my classroom," she said, voice cold as stone. Zay met her gaze, calm, unshaken. "I know," he replied, voice even, then turned away. A brief silence stretched between them, before he walked out. The hallway glowed with light, but Zay felt a cool breeze from an open door. Leon caught up, shaking his head with a grin. "What'd you do in there, man?" he said, voice buzzing with excitement. "You just turned her whole world upside down." Zay exhaled, lips curving slightly. "Guess so," he said. And this time, he felt it was true. He hadn't just played music today, he'd made them hear him, really hear him, for the first time in decades. As Zay stepped onto the narrow street near the French Quarter, the red sunset glowed on his face. He stopped at a small shop, buying a bottle of water from a familiar old vendor. "You look like you just did something big," the man said, teasing. Zay smiled, his first of the day. "Guess so," he replied, then kept walking. Back home, the smell of old wood and memories filled the room. He sat by the dusty piano, fingers brushing the keys, and this time, he didn't stop. A note rang out, deep and clear, like a promise to himself. He set his old canvas bag on the floor, sank into his familiar armchair, and stared at the piano, not with the hesitation of before, but with a new feeling, almost like longing. The low note he'd tested before leaving still echoed in his mind, a simple but clear sound, a reminder that music had never truly left him. He took a deep breath, stood, and this time, sat at the piano bench, hands on the keys without a hint of doubt. A slow melody rose, not as complex as what he'd played at the Crescent Community Center, but rich with feeling, like a greeting to himself. In the days after that class, things weren't the same. Word of Zay's performance spread fast, not just in the Crescent Community Center, but out onto New Orleans' narrow streets. Leon Brooks told the story to anyone who'd listen, embellishing a bit for drama, but always ending with a shake of his head. That old man played like a devil. Dorothy Miles was quieter, but she started bringing old tales of New Orleans' jazz heyday to class, often with a knowing glance at Zay. Anna Perry, the quiet one, now smiled at him in the hallway. The class, once Eve's stage, now bore Zay's mark, not because he demanded it, but because they couldn't forget. Eve still came to class as usual, but she wasn't the absolute authority anymore. She stood at the front, notes in hand, voice droning about music history, but her eyes weren't as sharp. She didn't mention the piano, didn't call on Zay, and when learners whispered about him, she pretended not to hear. One afternoon, as class wound down, she said out of the blue, "If anyone wants to share their talent, Just let me know. Her voice was stiff, like a reluctant offer. Leon glanced at Zay, whispering, "She learned something from you, huh?" Zay shrugged, not replying, but he knew Eve might not admit it, but she'd shifted, even just a little. The impact of that day didn't stop at the classroom. One day, while Zay fixed bikes for the neighborhood kids, a boy asked, "You're the guy who plays piano real good, right?" "I heard Uncle Leon say." Zay paused, looked at the kid, then smiled. "Guess so," he said, voice low but warm. The boy cheered, "Teach me." Soon, other kids showed up at his door, eyes bright, asking about piano. Zay didn't refuse. He taught them basic notes on his old piano, and for the first time in years, his house rang with laughter and music together. Clara, his granddaughter, visited one evening, bringing a bag of hot beignets. She stepped in, heard the piano from the living room, and froze. "You're playing again," she said, voice mixing surprise and joy. Zay stopped, looked at her, then nodded. "Guess so," he said, lips curving into a rare smile. Clara sat beside him, listening as he recounted the classroom story, not with boastful pride, but the calm of someone who'd reclaimed something precious. "I knew you could do it," she said, eyes shining. "Mrs. Carver must be mad." Zay chuckled softly, shaking his head. "She doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is I played." A week later, Zay returned to the Crescent Community Center, not to learn, but to play. He set up a small free recital, just the old piano in the classroom, and a few extra chairs. Word spread fast, and when he arrived, the room was packed, not just learners, but neighbors, the kids he'd taught, and Clara, front row with a beaming smile. Zay sat hands on the keys, and played slow blues, intricate jazz, and a piece he'd written for Esther years ago. Applause followed each song, but he didn't play for that. He played because he wanted to, because he could. Eve stood at the back, near the door, silent. She watched him, her gaze no longer cold, but still rigid. When the recital ended, she left without a word. Zay didn't notice. He didn't need her approval anymore. He stood, applause ringing around him, and for the first time in decades, he felt truly heard. Back home, Zay sat by the piano, playing a slow tune in the evening's dim light. He reflected, not just on Eve, the class, or the eyes that had once dismissed him, but on himself. He'd thought music had left him, that age and pain had taken it all. But today, he knew he'd been wrong. When people underestimated him, he'd let his talent speak, not to prove, but to affirm he was still here, still Zay Coleman, playing piano, for no one but himself. He stopped, gazing out the window, where moonlight shone through the old oaks. When people try to silence you, he thought, let your talent shout, they'll have to listen, like it or not. And with a faint smile, Zay knew he wouldn't stop playing again. The story of Isaiah Zay Coleman, in asterisk, racist teacher forces black old man to play piano to mock him, but his talent leaves her speechless, reflects deep issues still present in U.S. society today, especially subtle racism and the power of personal resilience. Set in New Orleans, where Zay lives and faces prejudice from Eve Carver, it recalls the rich yet unjust history of black people in music and daily life in America. Zay's journey, from an elderly man overlooked in the Crescent Community Center classroom, to stunning the class with his piano skills, isn't just a personal tale, but a symbol of the fight against the low expectations society often places on black folks, especially seniors. Eve, with her mocking tone and intent to humiliate Zay, represents the quiet biases still lurking in public spaces today, from classrooms to workplaces, where talent is often judged through a racial lens, rather than merit. The lesson here applies straight to real life in the U.S. Let your talent and persistence speak when you face doubt or discrimination. When Eve demanded Zay play piano, hoping he'd fail, he didn't just overcome it, he turned it into a chance to assert himself, silencing her and shifting the class's view. In today's world, where bias can show up as subtle remarks or denied opportunities, you can take a page from Zay. Don't let being underestimated stop you. Do like he did, step up to your own piano, worn or unfamiliar, and give it your all. When Zay taught the neighborhood kids and held that recital, he showed talent isn't just for pushback, it's for inspiring and building community. A lesson reminding Americans today that overcoming injustice isn't just personal triumph, but a way to lift up those around you. Subscribe to the channel to follow inspiring stories like Zay Coleman's journey, and thanks for joining us today. See you in the next video, where we'll keep exploring talents that rise above every prejudice.